Hello, today I'm going to present a research study that I worked on earlier this semester in my graduate program at ACE. The name of my action research project is, Does Remote Learning Work? To introduce myself, my name is Laura Wingler, and I work in the e-learning department at Ocean County College as an instructional designer. I also teach courses in the School of Arts and Humanities. I'm currently getting another master's degree in educational technology and instructional design at the American College of Education. Part of our research this year was implemented to determine best practices in areas in need of improvement in our industries. Due to the pandemic, I decided to focus on remote learning to see if there were ways to make it better and to help bring the style of world-class e-learning courses to the remote environment. The main purpose of my study was to determine if consistency exists across education from K-12 to higher ed in current practices in delivering remote instruction, to determine the technology skills implemented in 2020, and to determine guidelines and best practices for remote learning. When I began my action research, I used the scope of the following three questions to lead my research: data collection, and to come to conclusions. 1. Why do faculty and students think that remote learning doesn't work? 2. What policies and practices do other schools have for faculty to follow in regards to maintaining high quality remote learning? 3. How can setting guidelines for remote learning improve student engagement and success? And what should those guidelines be? The first set of data that I collected came from educators. Educators were limited to the tri-state area and were gathered from social networking groups like LinkedIn. The survey was taken anonymously by 34 participants via Google Forms. Of those surveyed, more than half reported that they felt their remote learning experiences this year were successful. In regard to instructional modes and delivery, most participants reported using videos from sources like YouTube, TED-Ed, and Khan Academy. 65 to 67% also reported in using live synchronous instructional methods, as well as pre-recorded or screencast lessons. In the areas of curriculum support, more than half redesigned their lesson plans for remote, communicated their learning objectives to students, and provided grading rubrics for their assignments. Interestingly, only 8.8% of those surveyed rated themselves as a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 in their comfort with technology. This means that the majority of educators were comfortable with using technology to deliver their classes remotely. Most, more than 70%, reported that their institutions provided them with some guidelines on remote learning, and nearly 60% felt that their students remained engaged, and a little over a third enjoyed teaching remotely. In the area of professional development, more than 60% felt that they needed, and their administrators also needed, more professional development. In this part of the research, 29 were surveyed anonymously from the student parent surveys. It's important to note that of those surveyed, 37.9% represent student opinions. It was hard to get student responses for the study, and I think it'd be interesting to see what the results would be if more participated. Of those surveyed, an area that stands out the most is that only 24% of students reported receiving synchronous live instruction. Meanwhile, on the previous slide, you saw that over 60% of educators reported delivering such instruction. The presence of YouTube Khan TED-Ed videos aligned with what educators reported, and the numbers were slightly lower on the reported amount of pre-recorded lessons and screencasts that students say they received. A unique area that was surveyed for students was the level of support they had available to them. This was explored because it indicates possible barriers to student learning and could potentially help educational institutions solve the issues. Of those surveyed, more than half had someone at home to help them with their remote learning. Only 17% had access to tutoring. Remember, this includes K-12 because most higher ed institutes have tutoring available, and a little over a third reported having no support at all available to them. Under tech and engagement, almost all of those surveyed reported that they were comfortable using technology, and almost half reported that they enjoyed their remote learning experiences. It was also great to see that almost all participants reported being able to navigate through their LMS. There was a question in my survey that asked participants about their preferred learning style, and 79% reported that they felt they learned best when doing something hands-on. I think this tells us something about what students are looking for in their learning experiences, and as an instructional designer, I try to build more hands-on experiences for students in the online environment. The last category that I want to share is about what students were looking for in their experiences. More than half wanted more teacher interaction, as well as more interaction with their peers. A little over 44% wanted more engaging lessons and clearer guidelines in their courses. Overall, the data gained from this survey tells us a lot about how to make future learning better for our students. To get a thorough collection of data, I sent qualitative questionnaires to professionals in education, ranging from educational technologists, deans, principals, vice presidents. A total of 11 responses were collected, and the following conclusions can be made. 1. More than half of the responses were specific to higher education. What many reported about remote learning tells us that participant motivation and flexibility within the remote environment are factors in making the remote learning experience successful for students. 2. Nearly half of those that responded mentioned that there were few or no specific guidelines, specifically in how to deliver instruction. So, for example, live meetings or recorded lessons. However, almost all participants reported that there are guidelines in place for the fall 2020 that include more specified modes of instruction and consistent use of particular tools like Zoom, Google Meets, and an LMS like Canvas, Blackboard, or Google Classroom. 3. When asked what matters most in the remote learning environment, the answers varied, but included support for students and educators, technology, consistency, engagement, and fun. 4. Despite everything that has happened this year with the pandemic and the overnight switch to remote instruction, multiple interviews mentioned that despite it all, staff and faculty came together and were unified in their remote learning experiences, and that faculty even felt more empowered by it. 3 of the 11 mentioned that some educators enjoyed the creative opportunity that remote learning presented to them. 5. There have been some lessons learned throughout the changes brought to education this year. Many reported that more accountability for faculty and students was needed. More synchronized learning experiences became part of the guidelines, more scheduled learning to retain student interests, and more training is needed across the board for everyone. In addition, most of those interviewed agreed that the remote learning experience is contingent upon both the faculty and the students' participation. The biggest area for improvement is mastering the more complicated technical issues. The last area of data that I collected was from public records of educational institutions. 3 random public institutions were selected in different counties in New Jersey, and all the information was pulled from public records, including their websites, board minutes, or news reports. While my institution, OCC, was one that I pulled data from for this study in this section, all information used came from these sources. For K-12, it was interesting to see that 2 of the 3 school districts put a higher emphasis on returning to school rather than improving their remote learning programs. Specifically, many reported utilizing remote instruction primarily for older students and getting elementary age children back into their brick and mortar classrooms. The districts compared were Hazlet, Pemberton, and Toms River. All 3 reported achieving a one-to-one technology status. Of the 3, Toms River reported detailed information about the extensive technology tools they purchased and their plans for more robust learning. In the category of 2-year schools, all 3 New Jersey community colleges reported a predominant delivery of remote instruction for fall with limited on-campus offerings. In the board minutes of each, all 3 reported and addressed concerns for quality instruction during the pandemic for the fall term. Additionally, only one of the three specified their plans for content quality, consistency by using master courses and instructional designers. Clearly, that one was Ocean County College compared to Brookdale Community College and Bergen County Community College. Lastly, for the four-year public colleges, it was interesting to find that all of them offered multiple modalities for remote learning and in-person courses for the fall. Stockton led the way with over 8 different methods of remote, online, hybrid, high flex, and so on. There were so many it was hard to keep track of. But out of the three, which also included Rutgers, only William Patterson clearly and publicly made instructional design support and consultations available to their faculty during this time. That is not to say that others did not, but it was not discussed or posted publicly to those outside of their institutions. One of the biggest takeaways from this study was to look at the similarities between face-to-face models and remote learning to see what unifies them. While remote learning has been a very untraditional addition to the 2020 school year, it still required skilled educators, consistency in instruction, some level of both synchronous and asynchronous activity, and creativity from both students and educators to some degree. Considering these are solid entities that both modes have in common, it gives a good insight about where we can go from here into the future. Overall, the study found a lot less synchronous learning occurred to students than it was reported by educators for the spring term. Some lessons were learned and guidelines made improvements for the fall. While administrators saw a lot of positives, their big call-outs to the negative experiences were technology issues and a lack of parent involvement for those in K-12. Maintaining a sense of self-motivation and keeping the tech skills of faculty up to par were said to be areas that higher ed could improve upon. Since my study was based on action research, the recommended next steps were to share the results with leadership, to suggest surveying more students and less parents about their experiences, to find deeper meaning, and to compare and contrast our institutional practices against what others are doing. With that said, this presentation was given at the November 5th Board of Trustees meeting at Ocean County College. An additional slide was included in the OCC Board of Trustees presentation that discussed what does this survey mean for OCC. I took a few minutes and compared us to other colleges and talked about how our master courses being available to our face-to-face faculty during COVID really helped us maintain that consistency that the administrators were talking about in their surveys. OCC also emphasized and delivered a lot of professional development opportunities to faculty and made it a point to demonstrate leadership on ADA compliance. As with the research, some conclusions were made. First, regardless of how crazy 2020 has been, it is incredible that everyone now knows more about technology than they did in March, so that right there is progress. Next, we have learned a lot of educators or team players and have stepped up to help their students and each other. While the study found some good areas to work on, more student performance data and surveys would be needed to solidify next steps in making profitable changes. And as suspected from the beginning, many have adopted new guidelines for fall and revised what they were doing in the spring. So again, much progress has been made. To answer my initial research question, does remote instruction work? Well, maybe sometimes. To be successful, remote learning needs to include planning, organization, and communication. These things are vital to a successful experience for our students. Next, structure and consistency in the learning environment, most notably the user interface and course navigation. Providing students a consistent and predictable structure for their courses helps them feel more comfortable in accessing their materials and content. And lastly, remote instruction works when technology is a tool and not a barrier. This means that in order for remote learning to be successful, it doesn't need to be bombarded with bells and whistles, but rather it needs to follow the basics of education and meet learning objectives before worrying about enhancing technologies. Thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to make the full document of my remote learning study available for review. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. My contact information is in the comments.